Good evening, everyone. My name is Claire Pittman. I am with the Stormwater Master Plan Public Involvement Team. Tonight, we are going to be sharing with you some information about your watershed, which is the Ward Creek watershed. We really appreciate you taking the time to join us this evening. We have a lot of information to cover, so quickly, I am going to go through. We have a lot of information. It is going to be going over the Stormwater Master Plan, the models that were developed for your area, and the codes and ordinances piece of this plan. You can submit questions by clicking the Join the Podium button. Those questions will be read to the moderators and speakers, and they will address your questions. We also have for these models, they can be very detailed. So if you want to make the screen bigger, click on the little segmented square at the bottom and you can make the screen bigger. That will make the Join the Podium button disappear, but that's okay. Just click that button again, it will reduce and you'll click Join the Podium to submit your question. Right now, I'd like to hand the mic over to Melissa Kennedy, our project manager and fearless leader. Melissa?
Thanks, Claire. Hi, my name is Melissa Kennedy. I'm with HNTB and I'm the project manager for the Stormwater Master Plan. I'm going to introduce a few people on the team tonight who are going to be presenting. We have Devin Foyle with HNTB. He's our certified floodplain manager. He will be presenting. We've got Jeff Dowdra. He is our technical lead. We've got Stoka Brown from CSRS. He'll be talking as well. And then in addition, we have one of our other modelers on the line, Eric Knight, in case there are specific questions that he may want to answer, as he is also part of the modeling team. So I'm going to give a brief overview of the Stormwater Master Plan and what the intention of that is. So the whole point of it is to really identify the flood-related risk and vulnerabilities. And what do I mean by that? We're going to use our models and the other data we've been provided to evaluate what floods where, how much, and being able to determine the damages as a result of that flooding. Then once we know that, we're going to look at solutions to mitigate those risks. And those solutions will be both projects, capital improvement projects, and additionally, policy solutions to reduce local flood risk. Those projects that we're going to identify are really to help mitigate current flood risk, and then the policy solutions are to help prevent future flood risk. And again, the whole program is really to focus on the mitigation of damages for as many people as possible. We're not necessarily looking at specific individual properties, but we do understand that everyone is important, and we're hoping that as we go along, we'll be able to address as many as possible. I'm going to turn it over to Devin Foyle, who's going to talk, give a brief overview of the watershed itself. Devin?
Thank you, Melissa. I'm Devin Foyle. Like Melissa said, I'm a planner with HNTB and certified floodplain manager, and I'm just going to briefly talk about some general characteristics of the watershed. So to evaluate flood risk more efficiently, the project team divided the parish into the 11 different watersheds that you see before you right now. Just quickly, what is a watershed? It's just an area of land that drains all of the rainfall that enters it to a single point or a common outlet. And the topography of the land, the high parts and low parts, have a very big effect on how that water behaves. So that's what we mean by watershed. And today we're talking about the Ward Creek watershed, which is popping out at you right there. If we could go to the next slide. So this is a LiDAR map. That stands for light detection and ranging, which is just a fancy way of saying a high-tech method for determining elevations. So the higher elevation is represented by the darker red and brown colors, and the lower elevation is shown in the blues and dark greens. So just quickly, water in this watershed drains to the southeast into Bayou Manchac. And you can see that there at the bottom corner, it's just very green and blue. That's where all the water is draining. So, but some major features to point out here on this map are two major ridges of high ground in the watershed. One is in the north. It roughly runs along from, I guess, left to right from west-east Baywell Streets, Corporate, Boulevard and Jefferson Highway. So that's about where that ridge is located. And that's about a 15-foot difference in elevation from the high ground to low ground there of that ridge. The other ridge is in the south part of the watershed. It runs along Highland Road and drops off into Bayou Fountain to the south. And then another feature just to note here is the Ward Creek Diversion Canal at the southeast portion of the watershed. So the canal was dug from Ward Creek through the high ground to get to Bayou Manchac. And you can kind of see the old channel dipping under the canal. And this is in a very low elevation area now. So if we could go to the next slide. So this graphic shows the sources of flooding in the watershed. Remember that water in this watershed usually drains down to the southeast. However, when there's a big event that occurs, flooding can happen in a number of ways that disrupts the regular drainage. So in the northern higher areas, those areas are more impacted by rainfall. So flooding has to do kind of with the subsurface system up there. In big enough events, all the way to the west, Corporation Canal has the potential to overflow into the Bayou Fountain watershed. And then if you kind of keep looking to the right here, also in big events, Dawson Creek has the potential of backflowing into Bayou de Planche. In some flood events, Ward Creek's flow can split going one way into Bayou Fountain and also going the other way towards the Amite River. And then very big rain events, there's a potential of the Amite River backflowing into Bayou Manchac and also up Ward Creek. So that's just something to keep in mind with the sources of flooding in this watershed. Good, thank you. So this map shows the FEMA special flood hazard areas or the FEMA designated 100-year floodplains. All of the areas in blue are the 100-year floodplains. And what does 100-year mean? It means a 1% chance of an event happening in any given year. So it does not mean that the event occurs once every 100 years. It just means a 1% chance of the event happening in any given year. So you can see the floodplain extend all the way from Bayou Manchac in the southeast to Corporation Canal in the northwest, and then even kind of up into that middle area where the I-10 area is. It's important to note that the grayer areas that are within the blue shaded areas, that's all development inside of the floodplain. So you can see development close to the waterways, to the channels, and also in that old Ward Creek channel that dipped below the diversion canal that we looked at earlier. Yeah, exactly right there. We could go to the next slide. So this is a drainage map, a map of the drainage system in the watershed, shows the surface system and subsurface system. So the blue lines represent the blue line segments are the surface drainage system, while the white dots, each white dot represents the subsurface structures that lead to the subsurface or underground system. So a massive data collection effort happened at the very beginning phases of the planning process. And collecting data is important because you have to know exactly what is wrong before you try to fix it, right? So the data that was collected during this process were surveys of over 300 miles of streams and ditches parish-wide. Over 800 bridges and culverts were inspected parish-wide, and over 67,000 of those subsurface structures were examined. So that's those white dots again. And so those structures were put into a GIS mapping database and then given over to the parish. So this all helped to inform the models that the modeling team uses to evaluate the flood risk in the parish that you'll see in just a minute from our modeling team. And it's just important to note just how much development is within this watershed. A lot of development is even close to those channels and streams that we saw that were very low elevation as well. So that's very important to keep in mind. So we asked residents to submit photos and stories of flooding through our email and social media accounts. And parish-wide, we received over 300 submissions. And so these images on screen are only a very, very small sample of what we received, but they are specific to the Ward Creek watershed. But again, they're just very, very small sample. Everything that we do receive, it's all logged in our records and mapped using GIS. Our modeling team uses that map to help identify on the ground flooding conditions and compare it to what they see in their model results. So ultimately, it helps us evaluate flood risk in the area. Next slide, please. So this map shows data collected on a number of different public concerns. So each red star represents those photo submissions that we just saw, also repetitive loss and severe repetitive loss areas, and 311 submissions to the parish. And important things to notice here are just many of the stars are clustered around those low elevation areas in 100-year floodplains, which correlates with those LIDAR maps and those FEMA maps that we saw earlier. So all of these maps together kind of give a good general understanding of the Ward Creek watershed. And with that, I'm going to hand the presentation back over to our project manager, Melissa. Melissa, you're muted.
Thanks, Devin. I'm just going to briefly go over the modeling approach we used. We used a tiered modeling approach utilizing 3 different tiers. Tier 1 is a very large model that covers an extensive geographic area, and we use that model for regional resolution flood mapping and as a planning tool. This model covers well beyond the parish, and it's utilized to evaluate long duration storm events that impact a large area, such as the August 2016 and May 2021 event. The second level is the Tier 2 watershed. This is a watershed model, as you see in this picture. This happens to be the Clay Cut watershed, but we've developed a separate model for each of these individual watersheds, and you're going to see that with Ward Creek tonight. This model is used more for neighborhood level flood mapping and planning and design tool. Again, for this model, we evaluate storms over a 24-hour duration. And the last one is a Tier 3. This gets you into a much smaller area, street level resolution flood mapping, and we use this model for planning and design. And we evaluate shorter duration storms, 6-hour duration, high intensity storms. And what I want to point out is the red box on this graph. You're going to see a close-up of that area and what it looks like for each of these 3 different models. So the one on the left here is the Tier 1, and you notice that the grid size is fairly large that encompasses the geographic area. Again, for this Tier 1 model, we are looking at major streams and major structures. Tier 2 model is a more detailed, and as you can see, it's got a tighter grid because we're getting into a better resolution to get that better resolution in a smaller area. And this one, we're trying to capture all the major streams and tributaries and all those major structures. And then the third one is, again, the Tier 3. And what we're capturing here is actually the subsurface system. You'll see it's a very small grid. And what you can see in this graphic are the actual pipes and structure locations. So we're looking at all 3 of those for this watershed and for all the watersheds. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Dowdrick, who's going to talk about the modeling and the flood hazard assessment results. Jeff?
Thanks, Melissa. Again, as Melissa said earlier, I'm the technical lead on the project, so I've been heavily involved with a lot of the modeling that's been going on here. But what we want to do tonight is provide you just a sample of some of the things that we've been doing in terms of the modeling and where we're trying to understand how these watersheds work and how the flood risk is throughout the watershed. And so Melissa's going to play the video here of about a 100-year event. Devin kind of mentioned that earlier. That's the 1% chance of occurrence in any given year. And so what you'll notice as the simulation goes through here is the streams, as the rain progresses, this is about a 4-day simulation. As the rain falls, the streams swell and then they'll shrink, and they shrink from kind of north to south, so the water drains off a little faster as you get in the northern areas, and then it tends to be wider flooding and things in the lower areas like Devin mentioned before. And so this is kind of the culmination of all the data collection and modeling that Devin and Melissa talked about. We take all this information, the LIDAR data that's collected, all of the survey that's collected, and then we make these models. And so one thing that I do want to point out in the simulation is area 2 there. that's Bayou du Plancher. And so it takes a little bit longer for the water to get out of that area because it is such a low spot within the watershed. And I'll talk about that here in just a little bit. But one of the things these simulations help us do is to just better understand how the watershed functions in general for different types of storm events, as well as helps us pinpoint what is the location of the flooding, as well as helps us understand what the depth of the flooding is. And so why depth of flooding is important, because it helps us understand what kind of public and private infrastructure gets impacted and how much it gets impacted, which helps us understand what the cost of those damages might be, and then helps us to focus on where those problem areas are, as well as prioritize where we might provide solutions to help reduce flood risk. So the yellow diamonds that you see there are just some examples of project areas that we've been focusing on, and the yellow boxes kind of pinpoint some of the areas that I'm going to go through here. So this first spot that we're looking at is near the Ward Creek Diversion Canal. And so this is a simulation of about 13 inches of rain in 24 hours. And what you can see here, as Devin kind of alluded to earlier, how that Ward Creek Diversion Canal cuts through the high ground and bypasses the old Ward Creek floodplain, which you can see in those yellow and greenish colors there. And one thing to note here that we see from this modeling is it's about a 4 foot or so drop in water surface between kind of those orange and red areas upstream to the greenish areas downstream, which is pretty substantial for this area of the parish. So we're looking into what we could possibly do to help mitigate some of that rise, because this does have very large impacts upstream in terms of areas upstream. It goes all the way up into Dawson Creek and all the way up Ward Creek. So anything we can do here would really help benefit the entire parish. And so we're looking at possible channel capacity improvements, as well as some potential floodplain restoration within this area. Next slide, please. So this is Bayou du Plancher, which I kind of alluded to earlier. One thing that I want to point out about Bayou du Plancher is that as Dawson Creek rises, it actually backflows into Bayou du Plancher and uses all of that blue area that you see is the Dawson Creek, or I'm sorry, the du Plancher floodplain area. And what we found throughout our analysis is that it's a very important area in terms of flood risk reduction throughout the parish. So we wanted to make sure that that area was preserved. And so that is an approved Louisiana Watershed Initiative project, that preservation area in yellow that you see there. So that will have substantial impacts in terms of preventing development from occurring within that yellow area throughout the entire watershed. Another location I'd like to point out on this one is the proposed LWI detention area near Kenilworth. So we're looking at a project there that will also provide additional detention within Dawson Creek to help reduce some flood risk throughout that portion of the watershed. And then while we're on this slide, we've been getting public comments about the Pollard area. And so we've also been looking, I just want to say that we've been looking at additional enclosed range system improvements in that area to help reduce some of the risk associated with that area. Next slide, please. So this is Dawson Creek again. This is Dawson Creek from about Interstate 10 down to Perkins Road. And as you can see from this exhibit, this is a very highly developed portion of Dawson Creek. It's been heavily encroached upon, and there are multiple restrictions in the flow through this area, as I think many people are aware of. And so I'll start maybe in the northern portion there in Area 1. That's an area of consistent flooding within Dawson Creek, and as well as Acadian Underpass there, which you'll note that we have an arrow pointing to that area. And so what we're looking at doing in this area is potential channel improvements to help reduce the water surface elevations through here and help reduce flood risk along this. But when we do channelization, we have to make sure that we also mitigate for any downstream impacts. So we're also looking at potential detention areas that we might put in within this reach in order to help us, if we can get the channelization and help reduce those water surface elevations, then we'll need to have that detention in order to mitigate for those effects. But that also plays into that Kenilworth detention area downstream as well. Next slide. This is Corporation Canal, which is just south of downtown and north of the LSU campus, kind of sandwiched in between those two areas. So Corporation Canal drains the downtown area as well as the area north of LSU. And it's historically kind of a low area. It historically drained into Bayou de Plancher. And so Corporation Canal kind of drains northwest to southeast there. And all of that entire area drains into that LSU box culvert, which is indicated in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And so that LSU box culvert is a structure that we would consider critical infrastructure or critical structure because that's the only way for that water to get out of that area. And so another thing I would like to point out is that Corporation Canal doesn't drain into University Lakes. It actually bypasses and goes around. University Lakes is higher than Corporation Canal. And so the possibility to drain Corporation Canal into University Lakes doesn't necessarily exist. What we're finding here and what you see, oh, can you go back? Sorry, Melissa. What we're finding there is that you can see the deeper blues or the darker blues are the deeper areas, the lighter blues are the shallower areas of flooding. But what we noticed here was that Corporation Canal had a heavy impact on the enclosed drainage systems throughout that area. So the system, because the system Corporation Canal backs up into those systems, that the water just can't get out of those areas. So we're looking at a few things such as channel capacity improvements, as well as potentially diversion of some of the Corporation Canal flows into the Mississippi River via terrace street pump station upgrades or possibly new pump stations in order to divert some of that flow and help reduce flood risk within that area. Next slide, please. So the last area I want to go over is the Homewood subdivision. This is just a great example of getting input from the public and helping us understand how flood risk occurs within the parish. And so this is from the May 2021 event. And so we also simulated the May 2021 event. And so on the left, the purple areas are the homes that were flooded in that event provided by the public. And so we kind of validate that our model with that information as shown here. And so in this area specifically, Dawson Creek, similar to the slide we just looked at a second ago, has a heavy impact on that enclosed drainage system. So we're looking at a few different enclosed system improvements, as well as potential backflow prevention to keep Dawson out of that area. So there's a few different things we're looking at in that area. This is similar to kind of what we're looking at in the Pollard area as well. Next slide, please. So just to kind of summarize some of the things that we've talked about, topography dictates flooding. We're looking at floodplain preservation where we can. Critical infrastructure is something that we're also looking at, trying to identify those structures and make sure that those are more attention is paid to those structures to make sure that they are functioning properly. We're also looking at safety issues and access issues like railroad underpasses, such as the Acadian underpass, to see how we might reduce flood risk in those locations. And one thing to note that we found through the data collection was that we found mixed drainage systems, which are the non-curb and gutter systems. These are the roadway ditches with the driveway culverts, tended to need a little bit more maintenance. Although they are better for water quality, they do tend to need a little bit more maintenance. So that's something we also noted. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a summary again of the types of solutions that we're looking at. Again, this is not all the solutions. We're still looking at all the enclosed drainage system areas. So this was kind of more focused on the open channel of the surface drainage systems. But again, we're looking at those floodplain preservation, detention, channelization where we can, and enclosed system capacity improvements. So if there's any question about any of those, please feel free to ask, and I will hand it back over to Melissa.
Thanks, Jeff. So I want to talk about the projects that have been approved or ongoing to date. I want to make it clear that although we're still working on the plan and developing solutions, there are things ongoing as we're doing that. And here's a list of those items. There's maintenance of the existing system that's currently ongoing by the parish utilizing American Rescue Act plan funds as shown in the upper right-hand corner of this picture. They're cleaning out subsurface system structures currently. And then there are hazard mitigation grant program projects that have been approved. 7 of those have been approved by FEMA. And so the parish is working on getting those implemented. And this picture in the center of the screen, upper left, this is Ward Creek at Segan Lane. There's a constriction in the channel there, and one of those HMGP projects is to remove that. Then there are 3 LWI projects that have also been approved. 2 of those are actually in the Ward Creek basin. As Jeff talked about, one of them was Bayou de Planche floodplain preservation. Another one is a preservation in Ward Creek further downstream by Airline Park. And then there are low impact development policies that some of which have been implemented and some that we're still working on that Stoke is going to talk about. And the parish is also working on a program of home buyouts for those repetitive and severe repetitive loss structures that have been flooded many times. And then there's also other work ongoing by others. The Corps is doing work in this in the parish. They're doing channel work to clean out some of those channels and channel improvements. And there's also the Comeet diversion. Ward Creek is one of those channels that the Corps will be working on. And so I just wanted to point out, there's been about $96 million approved of 100% federal funded projects that are ongoing or will be going shortly. And again, maintenance has been an issue with people. So when we did the data collection to evaluate the subsurface system, we also identified structures and the amount of sediment was in each one. And what this map shows are those structures color coded. Green means sediment up to 25%. Yellow 25 to 50% sediment, or I'm sorry, green 25 to 50%, yellow 50 to 75, and red greater than 75% sediment. And that's what I was talking about. The parish is currently working on cleaning those out, and they have more American Rescue Act plan funds coming in 2022 that will also be utilized. So I just wanted to, focus on those projects that are ongoing. The other ones that Jeff talked about are potential solutions that we're still evaluating and are not finalized at this time. But I'd like to turn it over to Stoka Brown to talk about the policies related to development that have been and are ongoing. Stoka?
Thanks, Melissa. As Melissa said, I'm Stoka Brown with CSR's Water Resources Lead, and we are helping HNTB with Unified Development Code updates. A couple of things that we have already implemented are stormwater conveyance checks that require drainage impact studies to include one-dimensional models that provide a check to ensure that any development does not increase flooding upstream or downstream of the development. Another thing are we've taken some green infrastructure cross sections from MOVBR and applied those into the development code or trying to get those implemented where they're available and possible. Lastly, in terms of the interim changes, we wanted to clarify a couple things in the Unified Development Code to make sure that everybody understood the true purpose of each of those codes. Next slide, Melissa. So moving on next, what we wanted to do, so those interim changes were things that we thought could be implemented without much impact or without potential negative impacts. The next thing we wanted to do was utilize the hydraulic models that Jeff talked about that were developed and essentially utilize those to help us understand and develop additional changes to the code so that we can really model those changes and understand what their true impact would be, so we can essentially maximize the benefits of these future changes that we're going to recommend. So we're going to be looking at the minimum slab elevations compared to the base flood elevations. Currently, it's 1 foot plus BFE. Does it make sense to bring that higher? We will be able to analyze the potential reduction in damages from that type of change. Protecting the natural floodplain features. Like Jeff showed on Dawson Creek, there was a significant amount of development right up to the banks of the channel. Should we look at some of the channels that aren't fully developed and try and preserve some of those floodplain features so that we don't end up in the same position in those areas that we are today in others? Next slide, please. Fill requirements. So again, not only the location of fill sort of up to the channel banks, but the volume of fill and offsetting those fill requirements. We're also going to be looking at changes to that, as well as just general drainage requirements for new development in terms of the internal drainage features and detention ponds. And I'll turn it back over to Melissa. Thank you. You still on mute, Melissa? Second time.
Keep getting that backwards. Thanks. And last, I just want to go over the schedule. What you see here is the overall schedule, and this red line shows where we are in terms of progress. You can see a number of the tasks that have been completed, the data collection. We've developed the models. We are currently in the process, as Jeff talked about, doing the flood hazard assessment and coming up with solutions to mitigate those problems that we're seeing, both in terms of projects and policies, as Stoka talked about. And then we expect to have the stormwater management report done later in 2022. Second, third quarter, and also the development of a 20-year capital improvement plan where we take those identified solutions, apply a schedule to them, as well as identify funding sources. And then the last item shown here is the public outreach, which it has been and will continue to be an ongoing process throughout the project. I'm going to turn it back over to Claire.
Thanks, Melissa. So I'm going to remind everyone, we have quite a few people on watching through our PIMA software, and I want to remind you to click the Join the Podium button to submit questions to us. While you're doing that, typing up your question, I want to also let you know that if perhaps after you've heard all this good stuff, you're still formulating a question or a comment or want to get some photos and things together to submit to us, you can do that through info@stormwater.brla.gov. We also have you also have the ability to comment via our website, which is stormwater.brla.gov, and then also through our social media account @stormwaterbr. So again, click Join the Podium, that nice blue button right over there. If you have enlarged your screen to watch the presentation, let's shrink that back so you can get to that button. And as we come across your questions, we will put them up on the board for the rest of the stakeholders to see, and I will read them to our panelists. I will also let you know that we have several members of the city who are working with us through this plan. So if you have some questions that relate to the Stormwater Master Plan that maybe someone from the city needs to answer, that we do have people available to answer those questions. So I am going to start it off. We had a question submitted through our email system, and it is from the North Branch of Ward Creek near the intersection of Drusilla Drive and South Maiden. And she said, can anything be done to reduce the damming effect that results from the sewer improvement project? The pipe ended up with branches and appliances during the May 2021 flood, which may have been part of the reason it flooded in that area.
I'll take that. We were talking about this earlier, and it's just a fact that some of those sewer lines and utilities, we'd love to have them go under the channels, but just to the nature of them, they can't. So we do recognize that those can cause a blockage. And again, the issue is, as you pointed out, the debris and garbage that builds up behind them. It becomes a major concern if that debris blocks an actual culvert preventing the water from getting downstream. Otherwise, yes, it can cause a problem, but usually it's going to have an impact on lower events, which aren't necessarily the issue. So on larger events, it's not really going to have that much of an impact. But again, if one of those areas is near a culvert crossing, which is critical to keeping the channel clear, then that's one of those areas that we would probably recommend as looking at and doing more maintenance.
Thanks, Melissa. We have a question from Ms. Jeanette. Is the modeling considering climate change impacts? Rain events are projected to increase by 27% in the coming decade, and we've seen some of this already with heavy downpours as well as prolonged rain events that have led to flooding in the Baton Rouge area.
The answer is yes, and I'm going to let Jeff talk about that more.
Yeah, so we are looking at climate change and how that impacts flood risk throughout the parish. Specifically, we're looking at how additional rainfall can impact areas. And as we go through the project development, we're assessing each project to determine whether how resilient that project is. And when I say resilient, I mean how can it accommodate any future additional rainfall that might be caused by climate change. So we are looking at that as part of our analysis. And so we'll be including that and trying to accommodate that through the projects that we develop to help reduce the flood risk.
Thanks, Jeff. Okay, so we have a question about, you mentioned where the problems are and that we are trying to open up the narrowed areas and to even pump out the water. Is there a place for the water to go with the fast flash flooding like what occurred last May?
I think you're still muted, Melissa, but I think you're telling me to
yes,
talk.
I wanted you to
So,
answer that.
I think I understand the question. So if it depends on where you're at in the watershed, if we're talking about like the Corporation Canal area, for example, the Mississippi River isn't too far away, and that's somewhere we can pump water, divert water to, which we already are doing in some cases, like for the Terrace Street Pump Station, which takes some of the water from Corporation Canal and diverts that into the Mississippi River. Otherwise, we're looking to continue to help preserve some of that floodplain that still exists within the watershed, as well as maybe restore floodplain where we can. So anywhere where we can add additional, I guess, detention features to is another big thing. So like I said, we have to be careful when we channelize or do channel improvements because it can tend to speed the water up and then cause a downstream impact. And so we try to mitigate that through detention or channel enlargement or things like that. So I think that answered the question. I hope that answered the question.
Well, I also want to add that, in terms of flash flooding, what we hope that even though it's a lot of rain and the subsurface system may not be able to handle it, the hope is that the homes don't flood and that there are overland flow routes available so the water can get out without flooding homes. And if that's not the case, then that is something that we are looking at as well.
Okay, thank you. When will work begin on the canal between Barkley and East Tom Stokes?
I'm not sure. I'm gonna.
I'll answer that, Melissa.
Thank you.
That's one of the projects that we actually set up for under the American Rescue Act, Phase 1. I am aware of the issue with that between Barkley and also that subdivision that had concerns about that. It actually impacts Oak Hills that goes to the railroad track into Dawson Creek. We have updated. I met today and met with the consultant dealing with the actual physical inspection parts that we have to do of the channel to be able to submit to the Corps, because that is a issue that we have to deal with. Anytime you use federal monies, you're going to have to deal with the Corps of Engineers on the permitting process and to be sure what may be wetlands, what may be not be determined as wetlands. All those factors are being looked at. That information has already been submitted to the Corps. We're feeding back and forth to them. And the reason that's important, it does expedite the process and does tell us which projects we may be able to move faster along, because there's less permitting that needs to be dealt with. Realistically, we're probably going to be looking at first part of the year, first quarter, before you would actually see work actually starting on some of these channels that were part of the American Rescue Act Phase 1. And I did meet with a lot of the homeowners groups in the area to explain what we were doing. And certainly I will tell you, we're just as eager to get these done as the homeowners are, because we do believe it will be a positive benefit. But not only cleaning that channel, but what Melissa, I think, may have indicated, we're also looking at improving the pipe crossings underneath the railroad would help facilitate more water getting to Wards Creek, which is good. And also the Wards Creek Segan Lane project that we have proposed that will probably be under construction hopefully sometime next year too. So all those things will certainly be a great enhancement for the drainage issues for that particular area.
Thanks, Fred. What projects are in place to restore the natural floodplains along Ward Creek to mitigate backfill intrusions on recent projects such as Ochsner Hospital, Our Lady of the Lake Children's Hospital, and Top Golf?
Rachel, did you want to answer that one? Maybe. Or Ryan? Those are, I was going to say, though, when designs are completed for those developments, they are supposed to take into consideration mitigating for the fill in the floodplain. And the planning people are the ones that do that. So there are requirements in the current codes. I don't know if Ryan or Rachel want to add to that.
Yeah, Melissa, this is Ryan. So all of those projects were reviewed and met the current code requirements when they went through plan approval. We are working with this group to look at additional riparian setbacks. We're discussing that now. So in the future, there may be additional setbacks along drainage ways and canals that some of the group is studying now, and we're looking at the data on future code amendments.
Yeah, and as Stoka mentioned earlier, we're also looking at fill and how fill is being mitigated. And are we doing it the best that we can so that there aren't negative impacts? So we are looking at that as well.
Melissa, we may want to also mention to them that through the Watershed initiative, we were able to secure funds to look at detention and retention areas along Wards Creek to help reduce some of those flows down there or during peak rain events. You may want to mention that too.
That is correct. There's a hazard mitigation project that was approved that is for distributed throughout Ward Creek. And then there are also the two floodplain preservation projects that I previously mentioned. And we are looking at, as we showed today, other areas of detention and again, potential floodplain preservation.
Okay, there are weirs retraining water near the Manship YMCA. Why are these allowed?
I'm not sure. Jeff, are you familiar with a weir, or Eric familiar with a?
I think I know what you're talking about, Melissa.
Okay.
There's a development, I think, over in the area, and they put in a weir as a control structure to do detention. It's a fairly older neighborhood, probably 80s. It's not something we would probably necessarily do anymore, but it does exist.
Okay.
I would just suggest if that's an area of concern and you have not submitted that information to us, then go ahead and please do, because we don't know everything everywhere. We know based on the data that we collect and what people have told us. So if this is an area of concern that we're not aware of, I recommend that you submit that either through the website, email, etc.
I will mention that that area will be looked at also, that was mentioned in the question, will be looked at when we address the clearing and snagging of the channel all the way out to the railroad track, which goes that point. That is part of the YMCA outfall area that they're talking about.
Thanks, guys. So can someone address bank maintenance? This directly affects flooding. Large trees are falling into Wards Creek as the bank erodes and blocking the flow of water. We have lost approximately 10 feet of bank behind our property in the last 2 years, as well as several large trees.
Fred, did you want to?
Yeah, I'll answer that. We have a designated servitude that are located along those creek banks. I'm not sure exactly where they are located within that Wards Creek, but in some cases, we have Wards Creek has up to almost 200 feet of right of way from bank to bank. Normally, what we do, if we do have trees that are falling in the channels, we do depend on sometimes the property owners to call us to advise us what the issues, and then we take steps to try to get in to try to remove those obstacles, so to try to reduce the flood risk. We're not over everything all the time. We don't see all those issues. And when property owners let us know, we take the steps to try to address that from a maintenance aspect. As far as how we're looking at future maintenance or what we need to do, on many of the channels that part of the core project, they're going to be doing the actual clearing and snagging that's necessary, and moving any really major obstructions outside the channel itself from top bank to top bank. That will be critical for us to help facilitate water movement. But there again, one of our goals is to also, once it's done, we are going to be required to keep it maintained. And that's one of the things that Mr. Kelvin Hill, who is the Chief Administrative Officer for Department of Public Works, has been working with all our maintenance departments and my department as ways to how that we can program and address that. While it may not be ideal what we have right now, and certainly that's one of the reasons why we're doing a lot of the clearing and snagging that's necessary to get our major channels cleaned up so they can help move water. There will certainly be something that we're going to have to sit down and figure out and program how we and when we maintain them. And part of the issue is when we use these federal dollars for these federal projects, they're going to require you to have a maintenance schedule, and then that's going to be part of that overall obligation. And if you don't meet those obligations, then you may be responsible for reimbursing for the work that was done on that particular channel. But I think ultimately we're moving in that right direction.
Thanks, Fred. Okay, so will the GIS information from the presentation showing the locations of stormwater inlet and pipe locations be available to the public or other agencies?
I'm going to have to ask Fred on that one. I know you're working on discussions regarding that.
Yeah, and I will say that was something that from our phase one, many questions were asked as where are we at, what we're doing, are you getting to my location? And Melissa, I thought you did a good job explaining the first round, how we looked at it, because they were either from 25% to 75% blockage. We certainly felt like those were the main priorities by the fact of what our physical inspection that was done as part of the Stormwater Master Plan. What our goal and objective for our next phase is to look at still continue to finish up some of those locations, because while we may have done 1,500 locations and far as cleaning and stuff and about 60,000 linear feet of pipe, we still have a bunch of those still at 25 to 75% blockage. We want to get those open and functioning. With that, we are setting down the criteria, and we've already discussed this with Melissa for HNTB to help to put together the priorities based once we finish these 25% of these particular catch basins that need to be addressed. Then we will move on to other locations that have had physical inspection already and try to address cleaning of those areas that are a problem. We were also hoping to be able to put that through our GIS with working with IS program, information services. We have met last week to talk about how we can put this in place, but we're also working with CES. I hate to say the name, but that's what it is, CES, with a company that we're doing the clearing of these box culverts and the pipe to facilitate where we're going to go next, so the public will know where we at, what we're doing, and so they can keep up with the progress and the progression of what we're doing on this program. I will just tell you, we have over 60,000, probably close to 70,000 in my mind, catch basins that we're dealing with and pipe and stuff. We're not going to get to all of them where everybody wants us to be, but we're going to at least try to address the ones we know we've done the total physical inspections and where there are priorities that need to be addressed. And certainly there's nothing wrong with the public asking for us to look at those. And I always try to believe that if I'm in an area, if we have a 311 complaint about a storm catch basin drainage area that needs to be looked at, we try to check those at the same time. I can't tell you we're going to go into a subdivision and do every one of them, because that's not necessarily every one of them needs to be done. At some point through our overall physical inspection completion, we will probably look at every one of our issues and be able to determine what needs to be done and what's already good enough to function at this point.
Thanks, Fred. So I would also follow up. We have several questions about specific areas of when storm drains and catch basins are going to be cleaned out. And I think, Fred, you've addressed that in a overarching way for all these various areas that people are asking about. And I would also add that if you see a blocked drain, you need to submit a 311 request through the app if you have not already done that. If the city doesn't know that your drain is blocked, and that is the system they use to manage and track what's going on throughout the parish, you need to submit a 311 request through the app, and pictures are always great and all of that good stuff.
Let me just one other thing, if you don't mind. That was
Yes, sir.
Talking in general about third-party cleaning. Our maintenance department, who is headed up by Mr. Reginald Brumfield, they do a very good job of planning and organizing the areas. When we go into a particular subdivision, if they have 7 or 8 locations in that subdivision, he tries to get to all of those while they're there. We don't like to skip around from place to place. What I was telling you is basically the stuff that we're going to do from a third party type cleaning out, which took place in phase 1 with CES. But the maintenance department does handle many of those. We have the crews. We have not a lot of, but we have crews that were able to go do some of these maintenance activities that are being requested as far as cleaning storm drain catch basins and also drainage pipe. They have that capability of doing that, but that has to go through the 311 system. And when they look at programming and they look at what's in those areas and they try to put as many in a particular area that they may be able to get to and try to address those and clean them. And then they will, once it's done, they close out the actual 311 request. So that it's not just the third party, which we're doing, because we're never going to catch up with just doing it with maintenance. That's why we're looking at third party help, and CS is doing that. And they will probably be on our next round of storm drain cleaning also. But I just want the public to know it's just not what we're doing under the American Rescue Act. It helps, no question, but our maintenance department does a very good job of trying to be responsive to the public in regards to drainage of catch basins, for sure.
Thanks. So our next question is about, in the presentation, we mentioned green infrastructure solutions and transportation improvements. Are we suggesting that green infrastructure solutions are only considered when there is road improvement?
I'm going to say no. I mean, that was just when we were looking at codes and ordinances, as Stoka talked about, we were looking at things that could be implemented relatively quickly and easily. And because the Move BR program already had these set of cross sections for the roads, utilizing green infrastructure, we just said, well, let's adopt those for roads and development. It doesn't mean that that's the only green infrastructure solution out there or what we are looking at. When we look at projects and solutions that we're trying to find to mitigate flood risk, we will also consider green infrastructure in those. And we may also include further green infrastructure requirements in the development code. We're talking about potentially requiring green infrastructure just for the first flush. And first flush is that, I don't know if it's the 1 inch or first 1 inch, 2 inch rainfall. I don't know, Jeff or Stoka can clarify that.
It hasn't necessarily been set for this area, but it's usually about 1.5 inches of rain. Yeah.
So we are looking at that. And then we may recommend just a broader program for green infrastructure that we're not developing as part of the stormwater master plan, but just a suggestion that we may recommend.
Thanks, Melissa. So we have only, I would say, about 5 more minutes left of the meeting. I would strongly suggest you submit your question or your comment right now. The Stormwater Master Plan team does capture all of these questions and comments and will email you back with a response within the next couple of weeks. So please, if you have a specific area, a specific question to a specific area, you can submit that now. I may not be moderating those questions over this public meeting. We try to get the best bang for the buck with the questions. So I'm gonna ask 2 more, but please submit your question now. It will be addressed, maybe not in this public forum, but we will get back to you. So the Perkins Row apartment complex have eliminated a lot of stormwater runoff. A part of this area was designated as a wetland. It appears that Dawson's Creek has been straightened near the railroad tracks in the Grove area. Will this plan halt any development in the old Dawson Creek area, which would result in a loss of stormwater retention / runoff area?
That was a lot. I'm not quite sure.
I can answer that question, Melissa.
Okay, good.
So there was a project by the Grove and that development to relocate and straighten out Dawson Creek, though there were extensive hydraulic studies and design and floodplain storage calculations done, reviewed prior to allowing that to occur. So I think so there was no reduction in floodplain storage with that project.
So
Melissa,
go ahead.
Just to add to that, many of the channels in Dawson Creek have a lot of curvature to it and have really have impacted the flow of water. What part of this channel improvement it did was to help facilitate moving water a little faster. And that's not always the best thing, but it does help facilitate water movement. But it also, they not only did they straighten the channel, but they also widened it. So, and they had to provide that capacity to offset any field mitigation that was set forth in the overall Grove development and met the requirements. We can all agree or disagree with it, but it certainly met the requirements at that point. And certainly, I think we're looking at many of these new type of developments a little more mindful to be sure about what's being regulated upstream and downstream of these improvements.
All right. So we have, I'm going to close it out with this, which is kind of my spiel anyway. It says, where can we present photos of the small dam in the YMCA outfall area? And I would again reiterate that You can submit photos, questions, comments to info@stormwater.brla.gov. We also are on social media, so if you were to submit photos and questions through Instagram or Facebook, if you utilize hashtag EBR Stormwater. We also accept messaging through the social media platforms, and you could submit a comment at stormwater.brla.gov. I would ask, do we have anything else from our panel that you guys would like to close on, or?
I just want to say that, again, we just wanted to get the people together to show where we are within the process and things that we're seeing, and, to thank those people that have actually, provided us information. We take that information seriously. It's been very helpful. And we will be doing this again later on next year when we have gone through and finalized our projects and our solutions, and we'll be presenting that again later than next year.
So keep your eyes peeled for, we will post those upcoming meetings on our website and on social media. So, and if you come up with a question that later today or tomorrow, again, you can email us and we will get back to you. So thank you for coming to our virtual meeting, and have a great evening.
Thank you.